On Being a Pagan. Alain de Benoist. Translated by John Graham, edited by Greg Johnson. 2004. Originally published in French under the title Comment peut-on, étre, paien? Under the pen name Albin Michel, 1981. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Chapter 21, Sex and the Body. The distance separating all forms of naturalism from the conception of the world proposed and studied here, also allows us to refuse the reduction of paganism to a sort of Gallic or Rabelaisian sensualism, if not one that is libertine or Don Juan-like. If one believes some people, to live in the pagan style consists of unbridling the senses, uprooting any idea of fault or examination of conscience, to eat well, drink well, copulate well, in opposition to the morality of the men in black who preach asceticism, abstinence, and poverty. Accordingly, an entire strain of paganism light has developed, based on Casanova-style libertinism when it isn't sexual esotericism or a Hollywood-inspired sensationalism. This primarily Latin interpretation, which smells of its inverted Catholicism, a carnival Catholicism of the Festival of Fools, obviously finds its principal justification in the Christian attitudes that led to the devaluation of woman, the body, sexual desire, and made carnal lust one of the 7 deadly sins. It still appears highly debatable to me nonetheless. European antiquity displays the spectacle, and is itself proof positive of a freely assumed natural sexuality in which taboos and prohibitions later carried by Christianity are largely non-existent. This fact has been pointed out hundreds of times, and it is enough, for convincing proof, to refer back to the testimonies of ancient authors as well as to modern research. See, for example, Paul Vane's studies on Roman sexual life. This does not mean that paganism can be summed up as sexual freedom. Nor does it mean that it is appropriate to imagine a pre-Christian Europe that disregards modesty and chastity and honors a pansexuality that accepts any and all practices. Such a picture corresponds too closely to Christian propaganda to be taken seriously, and those who subscribe to it, satisfied to make a positive out of what Christians deemed negative, are indirectly playing into their hands. While the sexual ethics of early Europe is generally free and devoid of any idea of sin, it is not free of standards. Sacred prostitution, pansexuality, unbridled passions, and the Eastern orgy are foreign to it, for the most part, and it is only during periods of decline that sexuality abandons all norms. History has recorded the terrible way in which the Roman Senate repressed the worship of Dionysus after the Bacchanalia scandals of 186 BC. Homer applauded the amorous jousts of his heroes as much as he sang of their virtue. Stoicism expresses with exceptional vigor a great distrust toward certain forms of unbridled sexual passion. We can also be assured that in archaic Greece, under the Roman Republic, or among the ancient Germans, a master of sexual teratology like Gilles de Rais would not have lived to enjoy a ripe old age. Wasn't it Georges Sorel who, in The Illusions of Progress, maintained that the decline of aristocratic values went hand in hand with that of ascetic morality? Casual sexuality, again not to be confused with a tranquilly assumed sexual freedom, is not essentially distinguishable from other forms of personality deconstruction. In Christianity, the devaluation of the body and sexuality, just like its scorn of women, furthermore comes partially from the waning of Hellenic society. Without fully subscribing, far from it, to the opinions of a Claude Tresmonton or a Pierre Chanu on this point, it is certain that Christian theology clearly accentuated features that only existed in more moderate fashion in ancient Judaism. This hatred of the body, as Nietzsche observed, contributed no small amount to the creation of a feeling of guilt that Christian moralists exploited constantly. For Catholic theologians, the shame tied to physical lust is the direct fruit of original sin. Without going to the extremes of Gnosticism, early Christian philosophy was influenced by Plato, who depicted the body as a prison for the soul and death as liberation, as well as a doctrine of the fall, which views physical existence as the cause of human woe. During the first centuries after Christ, even the theory of the resurrection of the physical body was hard-pressed to divert Christians from their scorn of the physical world, as well as certain diluted negative ascetic practices, which would eventually be banned by canon law. "What an unhappy man am I," exclaimed Paul. "Who will deliver me from this body destined to die?" Romans 7:24. Marriage itself, whose result would be the Christian hearth, is only a stopgap measure to which celibacy will always be preferable. The Council of Trent, in its 10th canon, would reassert against the reformers, anathema on he who would say that the conjugal status be considered in any way superior to that of virginity or celibacy, and that it is not better or more delectable to remain virgin or celibate than to contract a marriage. The Alexandrian writer known as Philo the Jew, whose philosophy had a marked influence on Christian thought, wrote, "God has no reason for his hatred of pleasure and the body." Saint Anthony claimed to blush every time he ate or performed a bodily function. Saint Jerome would go so far as to say that cleanliness of the body and clothing signifies impurity of the soul. Saint Brigitte exclaimed, "God cannot inhabit a wholesome body." Early Christianity heaped praise on filthiness. The Church began by killing the bath. This tendency is not to be found in Judaism. This tradition generally provides a much less misogynistic reading of the story of Eve's seduction by the serpent, Genesis 3:1-7. In the opinion of a number of rabbis, if the serpent did not address Adam, it is not because as a male he would have been harder to seduce, but simply because he was busy elsewhere. Likewise, for a whole school of Judaism, sexuality is not a consequence of original sin. Cain and Abel would have been produced before this event occurred. This is notably the view of Rachi, in opposition to Ibn Ezra's interpretation. The first of all the mitzvot is the stipulation to found a home. Furthermore, it is the importance of this precept that explains such practices as levirate marriage. The bachelor is considered to be an incomplete man. He is not eligible to preside over the day of Yom Kippur. As for physical health and cleanliness, the Talmud specifically says that it is forbidden to live in a town that does not have public baths, and adds that the delights of which Ecclesiastes speaks are pools and baths. What really needs to be grasped here is that the taboo and the transgression of the taboo belong to the same world, and it is this very world that paganism claims to leave through surpassing it. Excesses walk in pairs and provide mutual justification. The priest needs the sinner, just as the sinner allegedly needs the priest. The modern incitement to reach sexual fulfillment for reasons of hygiene, when all is said and done, has the same sense as the ancient admonitions for abstinence or the Christian imperative to procreate. Certain revolutionary sexologies define themselves with respect to the same values as bourgeois sexology. From Hippocrates and Galen to Wilhelm Reich, we remain within the same ideology of the effusion, of the temperaments. Georges Bataille, a theoretician of Dionysian intoxication and a pantheist close to a surrealist mysticism, and whose theory of eroticism reveals the strong influence of Hegel and Nietzsche, writes, "What one calls the pleasures of the flesh, pollutes not only my body and my thoughts, but also the great starry universe." There could be nothing more Christian, in short, than the carnivals and other grotesque excesses where natures overflow, under a form of intentionally emphasized lunacy, to sponge up the overflow of constraints and permit the dogma, once the Chinese lanterns have been extinguished, to take back its rights. There is nothing more Christian than this pornography whose only attraction is that it is forbidden, nothing more Christian than these lewd songs, with which the deflective ritual of diversion expresses itself. And it is perhaps not by chance that negative asceticism was especially preached by two Africans of excessive sensuality, Augustine and Tertullian in this instance, following their conversion to Christianity. I am definitely on the same side as those who exalt the strength and beauty of the physical body against those who try to devalue it in the name of the primacy of universal reason identified with the Judeo-Christian logs, like Malebranche when he bellows against man with the free and jaunty air, master of the figures that flatter the senses and excite the passions. But I also refuse liberating pansexuality, and do so for two specific theoretical reasons. First, because man is not pure naturality, he cannot be reduced to biology, instinct, and impulse. Second, because what gives him specificity is based on his ability to construct himself, not by refusing to accept constraints, but by those constraints he imposes upon himself. These two affirmations are obviously connected. It is because man is not fully acted upon by nature that he is compelled to form himself. Now, if we accept that man is not merely an animal, if we accept that he constructs himself through the mastery and channeling of his impulses, it is impossible to accept the subsequent reduction of paganism to libertinism. Even better, if man does construct himself, if the object and content of his impulses are not predetermined, if the mind shapes the body by exercising constraint upon it, then any anarchic unleashing of instincts is the equivalent of the very annihilation of the personality. The liberation of all impulses is not paganism but sub-Freudianism. In no way does paganism consist of thinking oneself free of all obligation and constraint, the avoidance of all examination of conscience, the deliverance from all existential anguish and even all idea of fault. In many respects it is exactly the opposite. Nietzsche himself said that the normal rule of life is not complete casualness but the constraint exercised upon the self. Grand style consists of becoming master of the chaos one is, and forcing one's chaos to take form. As was clearly stressed by Paul Valadier, one of the best current experts on Nietzsche, the opposition established by the author of Zarathustra between Dionysus and the crucified one is net the opposition between a surging vital energy, content with itself, and a morbid taste for suffering, but actually the opposition between a tragic way of living those suffering and the Christian way of tolerating it. There is a bond between the truth of the eternal return of the same and the renewal of the sufferings we endure. Nietzsche knew full well that the idea of suffering disappearing was in no way a superhuman desire, but on the contrary a desire expressed by the last man, attached as he is to the quest for comfort, individual well-being, and security at any price. Only great pain is the ultimate liberator of the spirit. This is the tragic value of suffering, which gives a value to the individual as being sacred enough to again justify an immensity of suffering. The original experience of Faustian man is the experience of free will, nature not being a fundamental determinant for him. Man makes himself a man by fully assuming his historicity. Henceforth entirely responsible, he finds himself prey to an inevitable, and fertile, existential anguish by virtue of this fully assumed historicity. This anguish, the new form of the tragic sentiment, is conducive to burning up the individual's freedom to transform him into a creator, in order, still, to compensate for his lack of duration with intensity, which leads him continuously to make choices in conformity with his plans. Hence the introspection, the examination of conscience, the unease about meaning, indeed also about guilt. To negative asceticism, which is a flight from the real and a negation of vital energy, paganism thereby opposes a positive asceticism, which results from the constraint one exercises upon oneself to construct oneself in conformity with the idea one holds of oneself. In the second case it involves giving form to impulses, in the first extinguishing them. Therein dwells the true contradiction. This does not provide grounds for the necessary rejection of aesthetic and literary paganism, infatuated with myrtle and laurel, the splendid body and tranquil sensuality, which for many centuries has inspired so many painters, writers, and sculptors. Devotion to the Greece of white marble, the fragrant odors of Olympus, the Alexandrian graces, all of these have their charm, and even a bit more. And it is also true that for the French literati of the 19th century, antiquity primarily represented a life more boldly sensual, more beautiful, and more hedonistic at the opposite extreme to the dark and guilt-inducing melancholies maintained by a Christian dogma which only seemed to disappear to make way for the ugliness of the present day. Nietzsche also extolled the great health of the pagan in comparison to the sickly contemplations of the Christian mind. Nevertheless, this too often academic paganism, congealed in the inherent static state of Apollonian finitude, this paganism with a base of laurels and cypress, round-bellied women and chaste naiads, sun and cicadas, this sweet, rural sensuality, this luminous and aromatic world, is quite often essentially reduced to a vibrant, exalting description of nature, its maternal warmth and hidden voluptuousness. This description implies and inspires an obvious sympathy for the pagan world. But by itself, it can in no way sum up its spirit. Paganism is not simply a matter of polished marble and acanthus, no more than the organization of Platonic banquets is enough to give one any basis to talk of real-life paganism. And this is why this form of literary paganism, of Greco-Latin inspiration, which gives a large spot to beauty but almost none to faith, has been recuperated so often by the Church or been lost in the quicksand of university academicism. Let's note, to bring the discussion on this point to a close, that it can in no way be a question of reducing paganism to isolated and fragmentary surviving relics either, such as folk beliefs or rural traditions. Of course, this is not an entirely negligible domain. We know that after 370 AD or thereabouts the word paganus had the double meaning of peasant and pagan. To Christians, remaining loyal to the ancestral faith, as the majority of rural dwellers did, was to serve the devil. The problem of pagan survivals in the calendar feasts or the cradle-to-grave cycle therefore forms a core subject for consideration. I need only cite the works of Arnold van Gennep, P. Saint-Yves, Émile Noury, and Paul Sibyllet in this regard. Countless authors have shown how the Church, after fiercely combating pagan folk customs, subsequently did its best to baptize them by giving them a more or less superficial Christian veneer, and how these practices have been maintained, sometimes powerfully, into the present. It is obvious that the reactivation of these traditions, intended to give rhythm to work in the days of the year, and whose utility was evident for maintaining the organic cohesion of families, cities, and clans, today appears a great necessity in the much more general work of re-establishing community roots. We must nevertheless realize that these festivals and customs probably only give us a fairly distorted echo of what they were originally, and, most importantly, in the best of cases they only reflect the lower forms of belief and worship. In fact, this folk paganism is only, to borrow a term from Dumézil, a paganism of the third function, which would explain its almost exclusively rural character. At the time of Christianization, the great gods mobilized the greatest hostility of the preachers. The little gods, considered less dangerous, were more easily given amnesty. Baptized in a more or less proficient way, they became local saints or characters of folklore. The paganism of the first function, the sovereign paganism, is therefore also the least preserved for the very reason that it was quite often the established elites who betrayed it soonest or most deeply. This sovereign paganism nonetheless remains, even today, the most fundamental. At a time when rural life seems to be the reality of fewer and fewer people, it would be paradoxical, to say the least, if a recourse to ancient Indo-European religions confined itself to a repeat of a peasant rhythmic scheme. It is another reason to keep one's distance from naturalistic tendencies.